So let me welcome you to today's lecture. Let me first point out this is part of the Social Science Forum series. And in fact, another lecture coming up November 8th will be the W.E. Du Bois lecture. And our speaker today is an economic historian, and the speaker on November 8th, Toyin Falola, also I think has some credentials, among other things, as an economic historian of Africa. So we're keeping a strong economic history tradition going, although he's going to be speaking on contemporary African immigrant communities in the U.S. So today's lecture, as we were just talking about, is the Jack Mullen lecture, named after the alumnus who donated the funds for it. It's been going almost 20 years. I think it was 1998 was the first Mullen lecture. It was actually, our first speaker was Edward Gramlich, speaking on the future of Social Security. You may think that's a safe topic, but actually, as I recall, there were some Lyndon LaRouche supporters who actually ripped up their Social Security cards.
My God!
That lecture. So,
exciting.
We've had a wide range of distinguished economists speaking on a wide range of topics, including, for example, William Baumol, among others, Hal Varian. Anyway, given the challenge of trying to characterize the very diverse topics today's speaker has worked on, I want to begin by mentioning the title of one of the many books she has written. The book is titled How to Be Human Though an Economist. And the title does suggest some tension, if not contradiction, between the two entities, being a human and an economist. So I want to begin by talking about Deirdre McCluskey's substantial contribution to economics and then to humanistic scholarship. So on the economics front of things, she obtained her PhD in economics from Harvard. Her dissertation entitled Economic Maturity and Entrepreneurial Decline, British Iron and Steel, 1870 to 1913. Keeps you on the edge of your seats, but it was awarded the David Wells Prize and published by Harvard University Press. In it, she used productivity measures to challenge traditional views of British entrepreneurial failures. This was just the first of a series of important works which pioneered the use of economic theory and quantitative methods in the study of British economic history. And I think it's fair to say that that field proved even more resistant than American economic history to such sort of methods. And so she has made a number of important contributions in that area. She's been, among other things, the co-editor of a number of editions of the Economic History of Modern Britain, published by Cambridge, which has brought together like-minded theometricians on the economic history of Britain. She's also been influential, not just in economic history, but as a teacher and expositor of price theory and microeconomics. Her introductory graduate level course in price theory, which I had the privilege of taking at the University of Chicago, went against the common grain that microeconomics is just an exercise in applied mathematics and optimization theory. So instead she advocated that price theory was a way of thinking about the fruitful application of central economic concepts. She's had important editorships, including that of the Journal of Economic History. She has served as president of the Economic History Association and the Social Science History Association. She's also served on important committees of the American Economic Association. We were just talking today at lunch that due in part to her efforts, there's some prospect that the American Economic Association may actually adopt a professional code of ethics, which it has not had up until now, thanks in part to Deirdre's encouragement. So now turning to the humanistic side of things, I think one spur to her humanistic ventures was her perception that economists are bad writers. She gave ad hoc sessions to us graduate students at the University of Chicago on how to improve their writing, and these were actually sometimes attended by senior faculty from the department. Yes. I remember one of them, the famous economist Harry Johnson, showed up to get some guidelines in this. So this led to her influential books on economical writing. I should have brought the copy of that to hold up there. It's called Economical Writing, and it's about to be reissued by University of Chicago Press. So she turned from writing to speech and communication more generally, arguing economics, along with most allegedly scientific endeavor, actually involves communication and persuasion. This led to her influential book on the rhetoric of economics and related series of works on the rhetoric of inquiry. But if you're thinking big, where do you stop? Deirdre has not been one to think small, so she went from rhetoric and persuasion to virtue and ethics. And as her title on humans versus economists suggest she likes to bring together disparate elements. So one of her recent projects has been involved bringing together two things often thought to be at odds, namely virtue and business, or in her terms, the bourgeois. And she's recently completed a trilogy of books on the bourgeois virtues. We have one of those up there, arguing that business people have virtues, but they've also been central to human progress. So she's by no means stopped there. She's also, among other things, brought God and religion into the picture, but I'm going to stop now and turn things over to her.
Thank you very much, David.
She'll tell you about how you can
Acquire.
acquire the book.
Yes, yes,
First
by all
things
means.
they
Bye,
have.
bye, bye. Thank you, dear. David was also an undergraduate student of mine, so I've known David forever. And he's my star student. I want you to know this. I'm going to tell you today about a large project that I'm so glad I've found in my extreme old age. I'm 75 years old.
No.
Good. That's the correct answer. About 10 years ago, I was asked by another woman, how old are you? And I said, guess. And she said, 65. She hit it right on the nose. Unflattered. And the project started as a defense of a life in business. And most Americans don't think you need such a defense. But if you're in academic life, you might see that you do. And in the journals of opinion, high-level journals of opinion, there's a lot of hostility to the business world. And as an economist and a historian, I thought it was kind of silly, that's all, kind of childish. Because after all, we take advantage of the projector. Well, actually, this is one of my favorite examples of advanced dropped ceilings. Sure, very easy technology. There's nothing very complicated about it, and yet you can put all the nonsense up there, but you can easily get to it. So that's where my project started in the early 90s. I thought of the bourgeois virtues, by which I mean the virtues exercised in a commercial society. That's all it means. And so the virtue of courage, which in an aristocratic society would be battlefield courage, would be expressed in a commercial society as enterprise, all right? Opening a hairdressing salon in a neighborhood that you think needs it is a tremendously courageous act. And the woman who does it is putting her heart and soul into this small business and taking a tremendous chance with her life and her self-esteem. And that's as bold a move as some fancy financial trick at the heights of the economy. And in any case, it's pretty clear that our economy, and I knew this in the early 90s anyway, always, depends on this virtue of enterprise. So if we sneer at it all the time and say, oh, that's easy, it's easy to think of where to put the hairdressing salon or what new technology to use for dropped ceilings. Any fool could do that. The hard thing is to read Derrida. I'd want to dispute with such people having read Derrida. And so my first volume that finally came out of this trilogy that I've written, called The Bourgeois Era, was called The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And my tool for making the point that the bourgeois virtues are simply the virtues of human societies, finding expression in a commercial society, is known as virtue ethics in the Department of Philosophy. It's not Kantian, it's not utilitarian, utilitarian being what most of my fellow economists think is the only way to do what's good or bad. It's to speak of particular virtues and the libraries of human reflection behind each of them. Courage, temperance, justice, prudence. Prudence, by the way, economics is the science of prudence. That's part of the library. And then there's the so-called Christian virtues, not practiced by Christians, I must say, very much, but they talk about them a lot. Faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Faith not being necessarily defined in religious terms, but as identity. And hope as being not necessarily hope for salvation, but having a project. And love, well, love is love. It's the attachment to your dog. On the one hand, I have a dog named Will Shakespeare, who's the love of my life, or attachments to baseball. I'm a Cubs fan, so I have a particular attachment to a particular object of my love, or to science, or to truth, or to God. So these virtues, you find them in the West, as I said, attached to the four cardinal classical virtues that I mentioned, and the three Christian or theological virtues, a total of 7. They're a pretty good philosophical psychology, as I argue in the book that finally came out. They're not too bad. It's not perfect, but it's fairly good. And you find them all over the place. You find them in Eastern thought, in the great East Asian thought, in the great traditions of Confucian philosophy. It's not just 1 or 2 books. It's hundreds of books. It's a whole library of books on the virtues. You find them in South Asia, in the traditions of Hindu and Buddhist thought. In other words, you find virtues in philosophy, talk of virtues, but also in literature and in movies. My favorite single example of this is Groundhog Day. If you haven't seen the movie Groundhog Day, tonight see it. It's a great movie. And it turns out to be a deep reflection that the best life for humans is the good life. Not the rich life, or that sense of the good life, but the virtuous life. So I was defending capitalists and capitalism, if you want to talk that way. I hate that word. I think it's completely inappropriate to the economic history and understanding of our society, but let's use it for a moment. That's how I started out. Irritated by the casual sneering that the clerisy, as I call them, the artists and the intellectuals, the journalists and the professors, engage in. I didn't like this. Now, I had been a Marxist myself. I've been everything. I've been everything, I'm telling you. I shouldn't use that phrase because Donald Trump does. So I've been on the left, and I know its attractions. But then I gradually, slowly drifted. It's not really a right word, because I've not ever been a conservative. I've never voted for a Republican. But instead, drifting in a liberal direction, in the correct and old sense of a person who believes, above all, in freedom and wishes to encourage human dignity. So that's where I started in the 90s. And then I realized that what I actually could do and wanted to do with this, this machine I was starting to develop, is to explain modern economic growth. Because once you decided that it's not true that though you gain the world and lose you lose your immortal soul, once you've convinced yourself and the world, we hope, that being an active person in an economy is not intrinsically corrupting. It can be corrupting, but so can be being a member of a socialist society or a member of an army or a priesthood. Those all can be corrupting, those various forms of life, and so can participation in the market. Be careful, kids. It can corrupt. You want to have an attachment to the transcendent, to a purpose in life. You don't have to worry about it right now. But as long as you keep thinking about it and trying out religion and art and music and seeing into the transcendent, you'll develop a love, a higher form of love than just for your dog. I saw that once you've satisfied yourself on that score, I mean, look, honestly, I tell you, if I had concluded that the economic life destroyed your immortal soul, made you an evil person, I would not be in favor of economic growth. I would be against markets. I would flee from them and preach to you that you ought to flee from them. But that's not what I concluded, because I don't think it's true. I think it's very far from true. So, virtues. All right, now, what is the explanation of how we've done so well materially and spiritually since the 18th century, considering that it's not been a spiritual disaster? Well, that's the question. That's the great Adam Smith. Now you'll observe that I always cross myself when I mention Adam Smith. The great Adam Smith wrote a book in 1776, The Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And that really is the central question of economics and is terribly important in any piece of modern history. If you're doing Roman history, you might want to know why Rome didn't have what I call the great enrichment. But that wouldn't be the center of your concerns about the Roman economy. Whereas anyone who looks at what's happened in the last 2 centuries, first in Holland, my beloved Nederland, and then in Britain and the North American colonies, and slowly in other parts of northwestern Europe, and then more widely and widely and widely in spiraling gyres. Till now, 40% of humankind, China and India, have been growing for decades in income per head at over 5% per year. So that's what I'm trying to explain, how we got so rich. Now, to understand that this is a real scientific puzzle, you have to know how poor we are. Some of you have experience with poor countries. You come from poor countries, or you've lived or visited poor countries in the world. This always happens. The batteries go. Let's see if we can, well, let's just hope it survives. This is Edison's technology. It's one of the earliest electronic technologies, the microphone. About a third of the time it doesn't work. So the engineers here, I want you to stop what you're doing and fix the damn microphones of the world. Anyway, you have to know how poor we were. Here's how poor we were. In 1800, the average man, woman, and child in the world earned, made, consumed the modern equivalent what you would be spending in Baltimore, now hear the figure, of $3 a day. Try to live in Baltimore on $3 a day. Well, you can kind of imagine it. You'd be sleeping rough. You'd suppose everyone was on $3 a day. Then everyone would be sleeping in crummy little huts, and their food would be inadequate, their health care would be zero, their clothing would be worn out, etc., etc. Right? So $3 a day. Now, you think, oh, that's impossible. How could you live on $3 a day? Well, people still do. In Niger, which has been in the news recently, people live on $3 a day. This is not uncommon. And my point is that in human history, it was common. It was our common existence until around 1800. And then there is this astonishing, uneven, but eventually affecting most people, increase. Now, the size of the increase varies from place to place, but it's converging slowly on a world in which the whole world will have an American standard of living. That's coming. Not in 300 years, but in 50 years. And how far? You know, it's like the late night jokes. How far has it come? It's come from $3 a day on average for the world, for every man, woman, and child in the world. In real terms, this is correct. You know, this has nothing to do with inflation or anything like that. It's real income, we say in economics. The average in the United States is $130 a day on the same scale. The average in Japan is about $100 a day. The average in Italy is about $80 a day. This is an amazing change. This is transformative. In China, now in mainland, what we used to call Red China, but in China, it's now about $30 a day. The average in the world now is $33 a day. I'm about to go to Brazil. I've been there before. I'm about to go to Brazil if by a miracle I can get through political arm twisting and sweet talk, my Brazilian friends can acquire a visa for me by next Wednesday. We will see. But Brazil is about the world average, $33 a day. So if you want to have a vision of what the average is, and by the way, this is all the same prices, $33 a day was about US national income in 1940. So the US in 1940 had the standard of living of the average Brazilian now. Okay, what an event. What an astonishing event. It means that people not only have more of a material sort, but they can go to university. Our ancestors, the ancestors of everyone here, couldn't go to university. There was not this wonderful campus you have and the elaborate facilities for dorms and blah, 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 and paying, fancy professors like my student here to tell you about stuff. That didn't happen in 1800. It happened to an extremely small minority of scholars in China, India, and Europe. All right, and so, how to explain it? Now, there are two usual ways. One from the left in politics and one from the right. The left in politics, and some of you will think this is obviously true, say it was caused by exploitation. Slavery, for example. American slavery, cotton and American slavery are supposed to explain the enrichment of the rest of the society, then amazingly also the African Americans themselves. And indeed, in England itself, the exploitation of the working class is supposed to have been the cause. There's a spoof history of England. The more you know about the history of England, the more amusing it is, from the 1930s, called 1066 and All That. And in 1066 and all that, they speak not of the Industrial Revolution, but of the Industrial Revelation. The revelation around 1800 by all the rich men in England that women and children could be worked for 25 hours a day without many of them dying or becoming excessively deformed. This was known as the Industrial revelation. So the idea is that you exploit the poor, or imperialism. Imperialism is supposed to have made the West rich. And this is a standard item in my former Marxism, and it's just there. It doesn't make any sense on a number of grounds, which I go into in some detail in the books, the 3 books. The essential problem is that the magnitudes are too small. Let's take the case of India, the jewel of the British Empire. Ah, yes, the British got rich because they exploited India. Well, that's false. They didn't exploit India, for one thing. They didn't steal from India, they traded with India as a free trade nation. To the extent that they directed sales of railway locomotives and so on to Britain itself. This is a minor advantage because if they had bought French locomotives, they would have been maybe a little better off, but not much, the Indians I'm talking about. So the amount of exploitation is very small. The trade with India, the large, was nothing like the trade with France at the same time. And altogether, the whole magnitude doesn't look right. And in any case, stealing from people is not a good business plan. The most brutal of many brutal imperial acts by the Europeans was the behavior of the King of Belgium, Leopold II, in exploiting the rubber resources of Congo. And this was truly horrific. I can give you all kinds of appalling details. Piles of hands chopped off to certify that they had collected their rubber. But you say, yes, that's why ordinary Belgians were better off. After all, they're exploiting the Congolese. No. The Congo was the personal possession of the king. It was his personal estate. It had nothing to do with the Belgian government. He used his profits from the rubber trade to build castles in the south of France. For some reason, he didn't want to build them in rainy, foggy Belgium. The Belgians were rich because they worked reasonably hard, and they were ingenious in making steel and weaving cloth and inventing stuff. That's why they got rich. So that's the left. On the right, the claim is, it's savings. It's savings, it's accumulation. Accumulation, that's also part of the argument on the left. It's accumulation. You pile brick on brick, and that makes you better off. Walt Whitman Rostow, who was a great economic historian, and had it not been for his disastrous involvement in America's adventure in Vietnam, he might have gotten the Nobel Prize in economics, or he should have gotten it, actually. He used to speak of the takeoff into self-sustained growth initiated by a rise in the savings rate. Now, this is kind of a, I don't know what you'd call it. It's a conservative story. It's a story that in order to get better off, you've got to be abstemious. You can't spend it all on fast cars and heroin. You gotta save up. And Max Weber talked this way, that fear of not getting admitted to heaven, fears about salvation, drove people to work harder and save more. And those are supposed to be the Protestant ethic virtues. And this is baloney. Saving doesn't, it makes you a little richer. It's like exploitation. Makes you a little richer, but not by a factor of 30. Not unless you've got a really new, good idea. If you've got, here we are, the example, Edison's idea for a microphone, well, it's a pretty cool idea. And if you put all your savings into this, and you fix the damn thing so they stop breaking, then you'll make a very large amount of money. But in the meantime, your college roommate saves the same amount and invested in fruit float or some other economic failure. So on average, people don't become immensely wealthy by, having a passbook savings account. That's not how to become really rich. Become really rich by being clever, by thinking up something new, by finding a $100 bill on the floor, so to speak, of invention. So you immensely raise. Well, there are examples all around us. I mean, take a look at your smartphone. Think of all the things it does. It's a tape recorder. Well, once you needed a tape recorder if you wanted a tape recorder. Now you don't. I just learned to use, now this is shameful. I'm appalled. I admit I'm practically crying. I only really learned to use Uber yesterday because I had to get around various places in Washington. I know it's idiotic. Your parents are this way too, dear, so don't laugh. But imagine how much innovation is installed in this device that you carry around every day. Drop ceilings again, reinforced concrete. Reinforced concrete was invented by a French gardener in the middle of the 1850s. He thought he was trying to make big pots to hold trees in. And concrete is a Roman and Chinese invention. We've had concrete for thousands of years. And he said, geez, I'm having a hard time making big pots because you pour water, the thing breaks. He says, they've just invented this stuff called chicken wire screening. So what happens if I put that in the concrete? And it turns out you can have much bigger pots that way. And that's the basic idea of concrete. And then there's pre-stressed concrete and so on and so forth. It's not savings that makes us rich. It's ideas that make us rich. Now you need the savings. You don't need the exploitation, thank you very much. But you do need the savings to make it come to pass. But that's not the cause. It'd be like saving oxygen and air in the air is the cause. Well, you need the oxygen in the air. If the oxygen goes out of the air, you're in real trouble. But you would hardly say that the oxygen in the air, little Joe smokes behind the barn, burns down the barn. What was the cause of the barn being burned down? it would be idiotic to say, the cause was oxygen in the air. Well, yeah, I see it's necessary, but it was little Joe fiddling with matches that caused the fire. That's the only intelligent way of telling the story. Okay, so what's my outcome here? This way, essentially what I've been doing for the last 15 minutes or 10 minutes is summarizing book 2 of this wonderful trilogy, which you can have on Amazon. Not on Amazon. Yeah, you can have it on Amazon now, by the way. You can get audiobooks of all 3 of this volume. You can read them on your commute from Silver. Well, you can read them on your smartphone too if you want to. You can hear them on your smartphone. All right, so what's the outcome here? Well, I'm telling you, it's that innovative ideas are what made the modern world. That's what changed after 1800. And wait a minute, why did they suddenly start changing? See? We've just created another problem, because I've said that it's the ideas, and it's rather, I can show economically and historically that that's correct. That's volume 2. Volume 2 is called Bourgeois Dignity. Hear what I say. Why economics can't explain the modern world. I make the case in a long book of 500 pages that the conventional explanations don't work. They're just not very plausible. These exploitation on the one on the left, savings on the right, they just don't work. They're not causal. All right, and it's innovation. It's what I came to call in the 3rd volume, commercially tested betterment. Commercially tested betterment. You get a better idea, you try it out on the market, see if people will buy it, and then it gets implemented and people are made vastly better off. If you add them all up, the hundreds and thousands of these innovations. Every year in the United States, now this isn't true of every single grocery store, but if you look at all American grocery stores, I hear this figure, it's astonishing. 20,000 new products are introduced. 20,000. Now, 99.99% of them don't survive into year 2 or year 3. But eventually, some of them do, and we gradually change what an American grocery store has in it. So there's this innovation that's going on, this turmoil, this churning, what Schumpeter called, in an alarming phrase, creative destruction. That's what made us rich. But then why did it start suddenly in 1800? I'm a historian. I believe in getting the historical facts lined up correctly. If it's so easy to innovate, why didn't the cave people innovate? Why didn't Rome innovate under the good emperors? Why didn't China succeed in having a great enrichment in the Song dynasty in the 13th and 12th and 13th century? Why not? Why not? Why not the Ottoman Empire? Why not South Asia? What's going on here? Why suddenly in 1800? If in Europe, if there's supposed to be something special about Europeans, there's not. But if there's something special about Europeans, why not in, I don't know, as I said, 1300 or 1500 or 16? It doesn't happen until 1800. Why? The answer, I think, is in a word: liberalism. Liberalism. And I don't want you to think of the word the way we use it clumsily or foolishly, I think, in the United States, to mean anyone on the left. Liberalism is left-wing. Is against liberalism and conservatism. That's not how you want to think about it. I want you to think of liberalism as free markets and free people having a go in free markets. Now, my claim is that the introduction of liberalism is what made us rich by bringing more and millions and millions of people allowed to have a go, allowed to try out stuff, allowed to take their investments and fail. Now understand, one history of the United States, an optimistic history, which I would say has a lot to be said for it, is of the gradual fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. When Thomas Jefferson, that driver of slaves, said all men and women, dear, are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He wasn't inventing this idea. It was in the air among advanced intellectuals in Europe at the time. Voltaire to Mary Wollstonecraft, lots of people were saying this. But in our case, this particular expression of it was especially powerful and keeps echoing down our national history. And there are subsequent re-expressions of it, such as the Gettysburg Address. And of course, in 1776, it was kind of absurd because it wasn't true. Poor people couldn't vote in the early republic that the Revolution and then the Constitution established. In many states, there was a high property qualification for voting. Most black people in the United States were slaves. Those who were free, again, couldn't vote. Women, hey, wasn't even a chance that they could vote. Abigail Adams said to her husband, don't forget the ladies. But he did. He forgot the ladies. And it took the ladies another 100 years before state by state female emancipation, so far as voting was concerned, took place. Female emancipation, so far as the holding of property is concerned, took about as long. Women, my mother could not have after the war, could not have a bank account in her own right. Her husband had to co-sign for it. That's changed finally. So poor people and blacks and Hispanics were taken out of the picture here. So what am I talking about, liberalism? Well, but it gradually improved. Then it was gays. Then it was colonial people. Then it was handicapped people. For God's sakes now, and I've been astonished at this sudden tipping point in American opinion, it's transgendered people. I'm just amazed by this. And so it's gone. So gradually we've gotten closer and closer to a Walt Whitman ideal of the democratic, flourishing, liberal country. So that's, you can see how powerful this is economically. When it's really true that you're not being held back by hierarchy, your husband sneering at your poetry or something, as my father did towards my mother, when people aren't putting hooks and chairs in your way, when indeed they're encouraging you to have a go, and you do, you will often fail. But if you're an American, you'll have this loony optimism that we Americans tend to have, not as much in Europe, but this loony optimism that, oh yeah, the American dream is available, as Obama says, to everyone who works hard, and go to it, kid, try again. If at first you don't succeed, try again, blah, blah, blah. And that's very good for all of us. Because it means that there are millions of people trying to improve themselves by educating themselves, by finding a new job, by opening the hairdressing salon I was talking about, by inventing a new kind of automobile. That's how progress happens. So the question is then, and I've now merged into the third book. As you can see, the third book is really thick. You can't see it unless I turn it sideways. See, it's 700 pages. Great stuff. I was going to do 6 volumes, and then I had got it down to 4. And then I said to myself, wait a second. A trilogy might be considered somewhat self-indulgent, but a tetralogy is an abomination. So I forced it all into this last volume. We're talking now about the issues of the last volume. What does liberalism have to do with it? Where did the liberalism come from? My answer is not that it came from some deep European superiority. That's not part of my story. It's a quite common story in Europe, but rather unsurprisingly. It's we white people who are better than everyone else. It's because we have common law, and we've had it all this time, and that makes us smarter, and you people are a bunch of jerks. That's kind of the standard line of Eurocentrism, and it's silly. It has no historical basis, no economic basis, no cultural basis. Stop saying it, it's stupid. What is true is that accidents, since the Protestant Reformation, since 1517, have gradually worked out to give people the self-confidence to have a go. The Protestant Reformation itself emboldened sects like Anabaptists and later on Quakerism, in which the administration of one's religious life was one's own responsibility, not the responsibility of a bunch of popes and priests. And that, not the doctrine of salvation, I think, was what was important about Protestantism. It's kind of the organizational matters that were important. The English Revolution of the 1640s, in which an anointed king was tried and executed. Now, anointed kings died violently, very commonly in Europe and everywhere else. But this shocked all of Europe. This idea that you would put a king on trial and say, you're a bad man, you did this against the law is superior to the king, you should get your head chopped off. On his scaffold, before his head was chopped off, Charles I was allowed to speak, as you are under English law. And he said, don't you understand, you dopes who convicted me? A king and a subject are clean different things. They're not the same category. A king can't be judged by law, don't be absurd. And then they said, yep, okay, dear, put your head down. This is it. And he very courageously did. By the way, Charles is going to be Charles III, if he ever gets the crown, Prince Charles, is named Charles because Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth, really didn't like it that one of her ancestors had been tried and executed. She found it quite offensive that this guy named Charles was killed by his subjects. I think she still does. So, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Dutch revolt against Spain, the so-called 80-year war ending in 1648, all of those turned out as they did in a way that inspirited people, that made people feel equal to each other, that made them feel capable of having a go. Now, all of them could have gone the other way, but didn't. And all of them could have happened elsewhere, but didn't. And certain accidents in the history of China, if you were a betting person in 1492, and you knew there was going to be this factor of 30 or whatever in a few centuries, this amazing change in income per head, you would have bet the farm on China. In 1492, you'd have to be crazy to bet it on this quarrelsome, ignorant corner, violent corner of the Eurasian continent. So that's my tale. It's ideas that made the modern world. It's ethics. It's rhetoric. It's how we talked about each other. It's not materialism. Matter is necessary, but it's not the crux. The crux was a change in the attitude towards the bourgeoisie. I call it the bourgeois revaluation anyway. A change in how we thought about markets, innovation. The very word innovation was a bad word until the 19th century. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, the successive quotations of the very word, it's always, oh, don't innovate, my God, oh, that's scary, that'll change the hierarchies. That'll upset the balance. The world turned upside down, oh no, oh no. It's only by the 19th century, and then even now we are obsessed with innovation, we love it. We have innovation programs in business schools and so forth. And when we innovate in the arts and the sciences incessantly, sometimes pointlessly, I have to say, but incessantly. So that's my story, dears. It's the spirit, rhetoric, ideas, our words. That's what made us rich. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. I'm the answer lady. If you have questions about your love life, I can help you. Anything. Yes, dear.
First of all, are you familiar with Yes Minister?
What?
The program Yes Minister?
Yes, I am very much, dear. Why don't you use this so they can hear it?
I think I'm all right.
No, you won't. No, you aren't. Hold it close to your mouth. Professors, for some weird reason, don't ever watch rock music. And they don't know you have to hold the microphone close.
When Sir Humphrey really wants to kill an idea, he says that's an innovative idea.
Exactly.
I'm wondering whether there was maybe one critical innovation that more or less preceded the development of liberal thought. That would be the printing press.
Oh, absolutely.
And that might have been, was it fortuitous? Was it similar innovation in China, say, at that time? Or
in fact, we in the West, it's actually typical of Eurocentrism that Europeans think they invented the printing press. It's a little tiresome. You have to keep saying, no, they didn't. The Chinese did. The Pythagorean theorem, there's a proof, elegant geometric proof in China 100 years before Pythagoras. And this keeps happening over and over again. But yes, the printing press is absolutely crucial.
I mean, how people think.
As the internet is now, absolutely crucial in our social and economic world. Oh yes, but here's a nice interesting fact. Why didn't invention happen in the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Turks were blindingly quick adopting military innovations. They had cannons, siege cannons, before the Europeans did. Mainly because they had been put under siege by people further east, Mongols, for example. Actually, the Mongols isn't a very good example, but cannons were invented in China and quickly made curtain wall castles obsolete. And then they spread west very quickly because, oh boy, now you can bring down an armed knight by shooting a musket ball at him eventually. So it's not that the Ottomans were just conservative, but when they got the printing press, they didn't let anyone use it. It was not until the early 18th century, now Gutenberg is 1448, something like that, middle of the 16th century. They didn't use anyone to use it to publish a book in Turkish, with Arabic script, of course, Arabic alphabet, not in Turkish until the early 18th century. And they didn't allow anyone to do a book in Arabic in the Ottoman Empire until the early 19th century. And because they didn't want the masses of their population learning anything new, no innovations. But very interestingly, they had an exception for the Jews. Jews wanted to print a bunch of stuff because they were very interested in printing and books. And in Salonika, there was a massive Jewish printing industry in Hebrew and Ladino. And they published books like mad and were allowed to by the Ottomans very early. By the 16th century, this was a big industry there. Did you see what I'm saying? That the printing press had to be allowed to have its effect, or it didn't work. But yeah, I have a whole chapter on the printing press. And a whole chapter about censorship, about how, it's not just to have a bunch of books, they got to be books that people can actually learn from. I was in Cuba in 2001, and in the engineering fields and medicine and so forth, the textbooks in bookstores were perfectly modern and sensible. But on the social science side of the bookstore, they were all Marxist, Leninist tracts. So they're allowed to print stuff, but only stuff that the government wanted them to hear. Sorry, that's a long answer. I'll encourage questions by being shorter. I'll say yes or no. Yes, in the back. Could you stand up so people can hear you?
Yes, my name's Dr. Mark Thomas. I teach a history of thought class. And just want to preface what I'm about to say, that I'm not a Marxist. But
that's okay. I was a Marxist. I don't mind Marx. I still have lots of Marxist friends.
The reason I preface that is there is a very compelling Marxist critique of the very idea of virtue. They would argue that virtue originates from the means of production.
Yeah, that's what they'd say. Or what we'd say.
Yeah. And that ownership over the means of production, whether it be like a Native American in the Midwest, and
sure.
during the time of the tribes, the best hunter
yep.
is sort of held to the highest standard or granted the highest standard of virtue, and then, maybe in the medieval period it would be the knight or the clerk.
That's right.
And then
I go through this in some detail in these books.
And then the bourgeois, right?
Bourgeoisie.
The bourgeoisie, of course, it's commercialism and capitalism, and they are granted the highest measure of virtue. So
finally,
so it's not their argument would be that it's not really liberalism; it's production and ownership. How would you respond to that as an alternative?
Because in history, as you know, results have to follow causes, not precede them. Causes have to come before results, not after them. And the change in attitude towards the bourgeoisie happens before the explosion of innovation after 1800. And in the third volume, which is called Bourgeois Equality, How Ideas, Not Capital or Exploitation, Enrich the World. You just heard a short explanation of all that. And the enrichment didn't happen till 100 years after the change in ideas about the bourgeoisie. In, say, 1680, England was still, England now, I'm speaking specifically and precisely, England was still virulently anti-bourgeois. 40 years later, it was still quite anti-bourgeois, but much, much less. And I give a lot of evidence that this happened about then. It's around 1700 that attitudes change. In fact, you can attribute it to the Dutch. Willem van Oranje comes across and becomes a William and Mary. And they start a Dutch central bank. They get a Dutch national debt. They get a Dutch exchange, a central stock exchange. They get Dutch this and Dutch that. Having fought 3 wars with the Dutch, they were just tired of it. And the miracle is they didn't adopt the Dutch language. My joke is that the English became Dutch in the 1690s. And this is kind of a joke, but it's also kind of serious, because there's a shift towards a business-admiring civilization. Now, this happens with much more alacrity in Massachusetts than in London, but it happens in both places. And then after a good time, out comes more and more innovation. Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, speaks of this matter. He himself was a quantitative, innovation-admiring fellow. He advised his friends, the Thrales, on their brewery in London, and favored them with calculations of how much could be made by making beer this way or that. This was a guy, Shakespeare, though himself bourgeois, the son of a glover, and himself a commercial producer of plays and writer of plays, detested the bourgeoisie, at least so far as the ideology of his plays is concerned. There's not a single bourgeois hero in all of Shakespeare. You say, no, Antonio, the Merchant of Venice, he's no, he's not. He's portrayed as a fool for love. He loves Bassanio. And Shylock is hardly admired in the Merchant of Venice, though he speaks in noble blank verse instead of in the prose appropriate to a lower figure. So there's a big change. You go from Shakespeare, my beloved Shakespeare, to my beloved Jane Austen, and it's palpable. Within a couple of centuries, England has become a society wholly open to innovation, to commerce, to foreign trade, to free internal trade. And that's liberalism in its economic aspect. Yes, dear. So stand up so everyone can hear, that's all.
So you spoke about virtues with respect to entrepreneurship,
I did.
and courage. And I just wonder, are they consistent with what I guess medical research has said about human nature when it comes to?
Who has said?
So there's been research in the past 10 years talking about how that entrepreneurship, especially with respect to finance, it stimulates the same centers of the brain that deal with cocaine addiction and other types of
Yeah, well, no, I don't find this kind of argument very plausible. I'm not insulting you, I'm insulting the people you're reading. I don't think research in the last 10 years can shed much light on the permanent questions of human existence. There's a kind of a arrogant madness that social psychologists of my acquaintance engage in, which is to suppose that their experiments that they just ran trump, I apologize for the word, trump all human reflection on our condition since the epic of Gilgamesh. There's something slightly loony here. You mean Sophocles had nothing to say about it? Greed is universal. Greed has implied is if this brain stimulation makes sense, and I don't see why it wouldn't, that's been happening in every society in the world since the caves. There's nothing peculiar about the greediness of the last 10 years or the last 20 years. It's not just people on Wall Street who are greedy. You're greedy when you look for a bargain on a dress. You're just as much an entrepreneur as the person on Wall Street is. So there's nothing weird about this. Look, we're in the hands of a narcissist, a clinically insane narcissist is our president. But come on, what's new about that? King Lear was a narcissist, right? How else would you describe it? We've been thinking about this kind of issue of what the results of madness in monarchs is since the beginning. And we have much more to say about it if we use the mind scanning equipment called the humanities than the brain scanning equipment that says, aha, you see it's located here. Marvell, the English poet, said late 17th century, the mind that ocean where each kind to straight its own resemblance find, but it creates, transcending these, far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made to a green thought and a green shade. He was making a decisive point against brain science, some 300 years in advance of brain science. Yes, dear, stand up.
Yeah. I guess I'm just looking for like clarification on what you said about the Congo.
Read the books, that'll clarify it.
Okay. Well, maybe.
Still better buy the books.
Buy them. I just wanted to see like what you meant about, I guess like King Leopold and his like exploitation of the Congo, because it sounded like you said King Leopold was the only person responsible and the Belgian public was not complicit.
No, the Belgian public had nothing to do with it.
But
they had this greedy nutcase as a king was something they might have done something about, but they didn't.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
To that degree, they're complicit. But
Yeah.
so is the British Navy, which allowed rubber from the Congo collected in this appallingly brutal way to be shipped elsewhere. They could have blockaded it, as some decades before they had highly virtuously blockaded the slave trade. From much earlier, from 1807 on, the British had a squadron of their navy perilously stationed on the west coast of Africa to intercept slave trade. Well, they could have done it, but they didn't. So there are lots of, I guess, if you look at it that way, lots of people to blame. But it's like the boy behind the barn. Without Leopold, it wouldn't have happened. Without this absurd, immoral exploitation of his personal possession, Congo, it wasn't a Belgian national crime.
So it's like the Eichmann thing where
Iceland?
Eichmann.
Adolf Eichmann.
Eichmann? What the hell does it have to do with Eichmann?
Well, he defended himself by saying that.
Oh, come on, dear, that's silly. The king was in charge. It's like,
I know, that's
your argument is like not blaming Hitler.
No,
Saying, oh, Hitler, he was bad, but really the Germans should have stopped him.
No, I'm comparing the argument kind of like in reverse, because like Eichmann said that
Yeah, I know what Eichmann said. I've read the book.
If he never had like gotten the position, it still would have happened.
I know,
But
I know.
Yeah,
That's what
okay.
I said. Yeah, what did she say about it? The banality of evil. Yeah, I get it. But that's got bugger all to do with the Congo. Now, there were other people involved. There were other Belgians involved. I admit that. The Belgian army was involved, and, as I understand it. But I don't know quite what your point is.
I just wanted to see if you thought that or like to what extent, like how complicit like the Belgian public would have been, and I guess I should have said, okay, zero. I should have said like including like the army, but
well, that's another matter. They're not they're the servants of the king.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you thought the king was like the sole
Well, he didn't go out into the jungle and force people to do it.
But without him, it wouldn't have happened.
Of course not. It wouldn't have
Thank
happened. I mean, without this, if he, well, for example, suppose he had to turn over his profits to the Belgian treasury. You think he would have been as enthusiastic about chopping hands off? I don't think so. So, let's get some moral responsibility here if we're going to get serious about this and not kind of smoosh it over and say, well, the Belgian people were involved and the Chinese, they could have stopped it too by sending a Chinese junk to the Congo. I mean, yes, oxygen is needed for the fire of the barn, but Joe caused it. Yes, dear. Stand up so everyone can hear.
So my question isn't really as sophisticated.
Just ask it, dear.
So when you were talking about innovation being caused by liberalism,
Yeah.
the quote, the metaphorical axiom that was ringing in my head was necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had the chance, would you change that quote? Do you agree with it, or?
Well, I have a friend, a social psychologist, who's done an amazing book about proverbs. And he points out that proverbs in all languages, Dutch or Italian or English or whatever, will often come in pairs. Too many cooks spoil the broth. Okay, that's an argument for not having too many people in the kitchen. Many hands make light work. Wait a second, that's the opposite claim. And he says, look, we have these pairs because we use them to think what the possibilities are, that's all. They don't answer the question. They contradict each other. Come on. So, yes, necessity is the mother of invention. But, a stitch in time saves nine. I mean, if necessity were the mother of invention, we would have had the great enrichment around 200,000 BCE, because we really needed it then. Or, I don't know, with the invention of agriculture in 9 different places in the last, actually between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago. Because then we got we first got rich from agriculture, and then we got poor because we were all peasants, and there was this guy with a sword who'd come around and steal it all. As Mansur Holson said, a stationary bandit. There can't be any simple theory like that. There is indeed a great historian named Toynbee who had such a theory. He talked about challenge and response. And he said if you're over-challenged, you can't respond. If you're under-challenged, you don't need to. And I guess as a kind of vague framework for life and history, it makes some sense. But some extremely stressed societies have been very innovative and very flexible in the circumstances. And some societies with no stress at all have invented a lot of stuff. So it's not very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have some free food waiting back there, so
Oh,
maybe
God.
one last burning question.
Okay, burning or not? Stand up there.
Sorry, guys.
What's your name?
My name's Christian,
Right?
and I have a question about you saying.
Just ask the question.
All right. Mark Zuckerberg earlier this year brought about the idea of didn't bring about, but he stressed the idea of basic income.
Yeah.
Can you share with us your ideas or your viewpoint on that and how that
Yeah.
differs from minimum wage?
Well, it differs radically from the minimum wage. I'm in favor of a minimum income, and many liberals are. Liberals in my sense. Milton Friedman was in favor of it. So were lots of people on the left. And actually Milton wasn't on the right. It's a silly way of talking. But anyway, yeah. The problem with the minimum wage is we kind of think it's welfare on the cheap. We can make these damn bosses pay more to the poor workers, and that'll make everyone better off. But actually it makes really poor people much worse off. There's a worldwide problem of youth unemployment, and it's caused more or less directly by old protection. It's caused by things like the minimum wage. In South Africa, there's a high minimum wage, which COSATU, Congress of South African Trade Unions, fiercely defends, and it's part of the government. It had an honorable role in the struggle against apartheid, so I get it. But it's a way of protecting lower middle class trade unionists from really poor people, the competition of really poor people, by actually a minimum income. What the government does is it gives very poor people a tiny income subsidy so they can sit in huts out in the country in KwaZulu-Natal and not do anything. And it protects the trade unions with a higher wage. There's a grave danger from the minimum wage and other interventions like this. There's a very good book by a man named Leonard, which you ought to read, about the role of economics 100 years ago in the coming of the minimum wage. And it came under American progressivism, state by state, and then eventually federal. And the declared idea was to prevent immigrants from getting jobs. That is, very poor people from Eastern and Southern Europe were flooding into the United States in the view of these idiots and evil idiots, and they wanted them to starve and go away. It had the effect, it was nice because for Southerners it screwed the blacks, for Western Southerners it screwed the Hispanics, for men it screwed the women, for old people it screwed young people, and for nationalists or nativists it screwed immigrants. So all the people, we white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, lower middle class men don't like They all get worse off from the minimum wage. And they said it. This isn't just some economist's imposition and saying, oh, I see their behavior must have been. No. They declared that this was their purpose. Whereas, at least an income subsidy is honest. I get taxed to help some poor person directly. The best way to help poor people is to give them money. I'm very much in favor of that. And then leave them alone. Don't say, well, yeah, you can have the money, but you can't spend it on booze. And I just, yeah, what? So it's kind of stupid of Zuckerberg to think he made this up.
Well, I didn't mean to imply that he made it up. I just meant that he stressed that. But
Yeah.
as a follow-up,
Why are you listening to Zuckerberg?
well,
What is his claim to intellectual power?
well, you're probably a big fan since he's so innovative.
I am. He's a big fan as an innovator. I'm not big fan as an intellectual.
The trouble, I think, would be how we have such a hard time figuring out where people consume anything or how much of it that they consume.
What are you talking about?
I'm saying that, yes, if it's the best thing to do for a poor person to give them money,
Yeah, it is.
but how do
And then
we...
leave them alone.
Yeah, but because the market will take care of that,
It will.
but how do we know where they're going to spend that money?
Well, what?
We don't.
Why is
We
it your
don't.
business?
Well,
Why do you care?
the thing is, if people are spending money on disproportionately on different things, then how can we see if it's an efficient market?
No, that's not what you know, but that's not what an efficient market means, dear.
Well, I mean,
We just let them decide what to spend it on. Actually, in truth, they'll spend it mainly on their children. And I find most poor people will. Some of them are bad, just like some rich people are bad, and they spend their money on booze too. I think it's shameful and we ought to prevent them. No, I don't. I think we should leave them alone. But that means, you have a real minimum income that actually applies, but you have to stop all the other stuff. You can't have public housing, which is a ridiculous idea. Why would the government be good at providing housing? Where did this idea come from? You put public schools, you gotta close all those, make all schools private, so that schools are competing with each other, just as people compete in other ways. You gotta take away all the other welfare and then give them the money. I think it's a great idea.
I think you're just giving us plenty to talk about and food
Okay,
for
good.
thought, so
Yeah.
we still have time for full discussion.
Okay, but let's focus on my ideas and my books, and in any case, buy the books. Because I'm not just an all-purpose Milton Friedman substitute. I've got a scientific hypothesis here, which I believe I've proven. Okay, thank you very much.